My wife asked for a divorce. She looked me right in the eye and said she wanted the house, the cars, and the entire company. She wanted everything except our son. My lawyer begged me to fight her. I looked at him and said, "Give it all to her." Everyone thought I had lost my mind giving up a $90 million empire just like that. At the final hearing, I signed it all over without a single argument. She smiled at me, thinking she had won the ultimate victory. She had no idea that by taking everything she had just signed her own financial death sentence. She kept smiling right up until her lawyer looked at the final paperwork, turned completely pale, and whispered 5 words that ruined her life forever. Let me tell you exactly how it all started. My name is William Gallagher. I am 70 years old, and I spent 40 years of my life pouring concrete, driving trucks, and building a massive commercial logistics empire in Dallas, Texas. I started with one rusty pickup truck and a metal toolbox. I used to sleep in the cab of that truck just to save rent money. Today, Gallagher Corporation owns fleets of transport trucks and hundreds of acres of warehouse space across the entire state. I worked 16-hour days, missed holidays, and sacrificed my own health so my family would never have to know what it feels like to go to bed hungry or worry about a mortgage. I thought my sacrifices had bought us a perfect, secure life. I was wrong. This story does not begin in a dusty warehouse or a corporate boardroom. It begins on the night of my 70th birthday gala. I had rented out the main ballroom at the Oak Creek Country Club. The room was filled with 300 people. There were local politicians, business partners, real estate developers, and people who simply wanted to be close to my money. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Waiters carried silver trays filled with expensive champagne. I was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, but if you looked closely at my hands, you could still see the thick calluses from my days doing manual labor. I was standing near the entrance, shaking hands with the mayor of Dallas. He was telling me a joke, laughing loudly, but my attention suddenly drifted. The heavy ballroom doors were slightly open, and the hallway outside was dimly lit. That was when I saw her. My wife, Victoria. We had been married for 30 years. She was 58 years old, wearing a stunning black evening gown, looking just as elegant and composed as the day I first met her. But she was not acting like a gracious hostess. She was looking around nervously, making sure no one was watching her. She was standing in the alcove with Derek Vance. Derek was my chief financial officer. He was 42 years old. I hired him 20 years ago when he was just an intern fresh out of college. I taught him everything I knew. I mentored him, promoted him, and paid him enough to make him a millionaire. I trusted him like a second son. Through the crack in the doors, I watched Victoria reach into her designer handbag. She pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope and slipped it directly into Derek's open leather briefcase. Derek nodded, quickly snapped the briefcase shut, and walked away down the corridor without looking back. Victoria took a deep breath, smoothed the front of her dress, plastered a perfect, radiant smile on her face, and walked back into the crowded ballroom. A heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. A man does not build a $90 million empire by ignoring small details. My gut told me something was terribly wrong. But I am not a man who panics. I kept my face perfectly calm. I finished my conversation with the mayor, smiled, and slowly made my way back to the main table at the center of the room. Victoria sat down right next to me. She placed her hand gently over mine for the photographers. Her skin was ice cold. A few minutes later, the lights in the ballroom dimmed. The double doors swung open, and the catering staff wheeled out a massive multi-tiered birthday cake. The entire room erupted into applause. 300 people stood up and started singing happy birthday to me. The music was loud, the voices were booming, and the flashes from the cameras were blinding. It was supposed to be the proudest moment of my life. Victoria leaned in very close to my ear. With all the noise in the room, no one else could possibly hear what she was saying. I thought she was going to tell me she loved me. I thought she was going to wish me a happy birthday. Instead, her voice was sharp, steady, and completely devoid of any human emotion. She whispered, "I filed for divorce this morning. I want the company. I want the estates. I want the cars. I want absolutely everything except Lucas. Make sure your son gets nothing." The room continued to sing. The applause roared around us, but all the sound completely faded from my ears. I sat frozen, staring blankly at the candles burning brightly on my birthday cake. My own wife, 30 years of marriage, telling me she was taking my life's work and, worse, deliberately trying to destroy our only child. Lucas was 28 years old. He was a good, honest, and humble kid. I had purposely placed him at the very bottom of the company ladder, working as a junior floor manager in one of my oldest warehouses. I wanted him to learn the value of hard work. I wanted him to sweat to understand the people who worked for us and to earn his keep before I ever considered handing him the keys to the kingdom. He never complained. He was currently working brutal extra night shifts just to support his pregnant wife, Rachel. And here was his own mother sitting in a multi-thousand-dollar designer gown demanding that I cut her own child out of the family trust completely and leave him with absolutely nothing. I turned my head very slowly to look at Victoria. She was still smiling brightly for the guests, clapping her hands together to the rhythm of the song. The sheer cruelty of her words contrasting with the perfect, loving smile on her face made my blood run cold. She did not want just a divorce. She wanted to annihilate my bloodline. Before I could even process the shock, the singing ended, and the microphone on the main stage screeched loudly. The room fell silent. Derek, my trusted chief financial officer, stood on the stage under the bright spotlight. He held a crystal glass of expensive champagne high in the air. He looked out over the crowd of 300 people, but his eyes bypassed the politicians and the investors. His eyes locked directly onto mine. I saw a slight, deeply arrogant smirk pull at the corner of his mouth. It was the look of a man who thought he held all the winning cards. He tapped his glass, and his voice boomed over the speakers. "Let us make a toast to William Gallagher, a man who built an incredible, unmatched legacy. A legacy that is finally ready to be passed on to the next generation." It hit me like a freight train. The secret meeting in the hallway. The thick envelope slipped into the briefcase. Victoria's brutal whisper. Derek's mocking toast about my legacy moving on. This was not a sudden marital dispute. This was a coordinated, deeply calculated attack from the inside. The two people I trusted most in the world had formed an alliance to take everything I owned and discard me like trash. They thought I was just an old fool, too tired and too trusting to fight back. They thought I would roll over and surrender my empire out of shock and heartbreak. They thought wrong. As I raised my glass to acknowledge the toast, I did not show an ounce of fear. I smiled back at Derek. I smiled at Victoria, because in that exact moment, the loving husband and the generous mentor died. I was a businessman again, and they had just declared war on a man who knew exactly how to bury his enemies. I stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by 300 cheering guests, as my chief financial officer lowered his champagne glass with a mocking smirk. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. This was a coordinated, deeply calculated attack from the inside. But I did not panic. I simply smiled, nodded to the crowd, and calmly escorted my wife out of the building. The ride back to our estate in North Dallas was the longest 20 minutes of my entire life. Victoria sat in the passenger seat of my classic pickup truck. I always drove the truck to keep me grounded. The hum of the engine was the only sound breaking the suffocating silence inside the cabin. She stared out the window, perfectly composed, humming softly to the faint country music playing on the radio. Without hearing those vicious words in the hallway, I would have seen the same devoted wife I had cherished for 3 decades. Instead, I saw a stranger, a very cold, dangerous stranger. We pulled through the wrought iron gates of our property and parked in the circular driveway. The moment I cut the engine, the heavy silence returned. I did not get out of the truck. I gripped the steering wheel. Victoria reached for her door handle, but she paused when she noticed I was not moving. She turned to me with a look of innocent concern. "William, is everything all right?" she asked sweetly. "You should be happy." It was a beautiful birthday gala. I took a deep breath. I let my hands drop from the steering wheel. I turned my head and looked directly into her eyes. "What exactly are you and Derek planning for Lucas?" I asked. My voice was completely flat and direct. For a second, the mask slipped. She was caught. She realized I had heard her. But Victoria is a master of emotional manipulation. The shock vanished as quickly as it appeared, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, overwhelming panic. Her lower lip began to tremble. Tears welled up in her eyes, perfectly timed. She slid across the leather seat and grabbed my arm with both hands. "I did not want you to find out like this," she sobbed into my shoulder. "I was trying to protect you. I am sorry. I was just trying to protect our family." I sat rigid, letting her cry. "Protect us from what, Victoria?" I asked quietly. "Protect us by stripping your own son of his inheritance, by taking the company I built." She pulled back, looking up at me with mascara running down her cheeks. It was an Oscar-winning performance. "You do not understand how bad it is," she choked out, her voice cracking. "Lucas is in terrible trouble. He has developed a severe gambling addiction over the last year. He has been going to underground casinos. William, he owes $3 million to a cartel. They are threatening him. They are threatening all of us." I stared at her, letting the words hang in the air. Lucas barely had time to sleep between warehouse shifts, let alone run up mob debt. But I kept my expression neutral. I let my eyes widen, pretending to be the shocked, terrified father. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, playing my part perfectly. "Why did he not come to me?" "Because he is terrified of disappointing you," Victoria cried, squeezing my hands. "The cartel knows who you are. They know about the company. They are planning to come after the corporate assets to settle his debt. Derek found out about it last month. We tried to fix it without giving you a heart attack. You know what your doctor said about your blood pressure. I could not let this stress kill you." She wiped her eyes, taking a shaky breath, trying to look like a brave martyr. "Derek came up with a legal maneuver, an asset protection strategy. If I file for divorce and we transfer the house, the cars, and the company entirely into my name, it creates a legal firewall. We sever Lucas from the family trust completely. On paper, he will have absolutely nothing, and he will not be tied to the corporate empire. When the cartel tries to seize his assets, they will hit a brick wall. I am taking it all on paper to save our empire, William. We have to be ruthless to save our boy." I looked at the tears streaming down her face. The logic was twisted, but to a desperate, uninformed father, it might have sounded plausible. It was the perfect lie. It preyed on my love for my son and my instinct to protect my business. She was painting herself as the ultimate savior, willing to take on the burden of a fake divorce just to shield us from ruin. If I had not seen Derek's arrogant smirk during the toast, I might have fallen for it. But I knew the truth. They were not trying to save Lucas. They were trying to bankrupt him so he could never afford a lawyer to challenge them for the company. I needed her to believe that her manipulation had worked. I needed her to feel completely safe and victorious. If I exposed her lie right now, Derek would start draining the corporate accounts by morning. I had to play the game. I let out a long, shuddering breath. I let my shoulders slump, releasing all the tension in my body. I raised my hands and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. I pulled her into a tight embrace, burying my face in her hair. "My God, Victoria," I whispered, injecting a fake tremor into my voice. "I had no idea. I am so sorry I doubted you. You are right. We have to do whatever it takes to protect him. We will follow Derek's plan. We will save our son." She let out a heavy sigh of relief, wrapping her arms around my neck. "I love you, William. Everything is going to be fine. Just let Derek handle the paperwork. Trust us." "I do," I lied softly. "I trust you completely." We held each other in the dark cabin of the truck. She was playing the relieved wife, and I was playing the grateful husband. We were two completely different people, trapped in a marriage that had just become a battlefield. As I held her holding the woman who was actively plotting my total ruin, I felt a slight vibration against my chest. My cell phone tucked inside the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket buzzed once. Then it buzzed again. A short, sharp, double vibration. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the phone. "Just a message from the club manager," I murmured. I glanced down. It was an automated security alert from our primary offshore reserve bank in the Cayman Islands. The text was devastatingly clear. It read, "Primary account access privileges for William Gallagher have been permanently revoked by Chief Financial Officer Derek Vance." The war was no longer approaching. It had already arrived, and my enemies had fired the first devastating shot. I stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by 300 cheering guests, as my chief financial officer lowered his champagne glass with a mocking smirk. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. This was a coordinated, deeply calculated attack from the inside. But I did not panic. I simply smiled, nodded to the crowd, and calmly escorted my wife out of the building. The ride back to our estate in North Dallas was the longest 20 minutes of my entire life. Victoria sat in the passenger seat of my classic pickup truck. I always drove the truck to keep me grounded. The hum of the engine was the only sound breaking the suffocating silence inside the cabin. She stared out the window, perfectly composed, humming softly to the faint country music playing on the radio. Without hearing those vicious words in the hallway, I would have seen the same devoted wife I had cherished for 3 decades. Instead, I saw a stranger. A very cold, dangerous stranger. We pulled through the wrought iron gates of our property and parked in the circular driveway. The moment I cut the engine, the heavy silence returned. I did not get out of the truck. I gripped the steering wheel. Victoria reached for her door handle, but she paused when she noticed I was not moving. She turned to me with a look of innocent concern. "William, is everything all right?" she asked sweetly. "You should be happy. It was a beautiful birthday gala." I took a deep breath. I let my hands drop from the steering wheel. I turned my head and looked directly into her eyes. "What exactly are you and Derek planning for Lucas?" I asked. My voice was completely flat and direct. For a second, the mask slipped. She was caught. She realized I had heard her. But Victoria is a master of emotional manipulation. The shock vanished as quickly as it appeared, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, overwhelming panic. Her lower lip began to tremble. Tears welled up in her eyes, perfectly timed. She slid across the leather seat and grabbed my arm with both hands. "I did not want you to find out like this," she sobbed into my shoulder. "I was trying to protect you. I am sorry. I was just trying to protect our family." I sat rigid, letting her cry. "Protect us from what, Victoria?" I asked quietly. "Protect us by stripping your own son of his inheritance, by taking the company I built." She pulled back, looking up at me with mascara running down her cheeks. It was an Oscar-winning performance. "You do not understand how bad it is," she choked out, her voice cracking. "Lucas is in terrible trouble. He has developed a severe gambling addiction over the last year. He has been going to underground casinos. William, he owes $3 million to a cartel. They are threatening him. They are threatening all of us." I stared at her, letting the words hang in the air. Lucas barely had time to sleep between warehouse shifts, let alone run up mob debt. But I kept my expression neutral. I let my eyes widen, pretending to be the shocked, terrified father. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, playing my part perfectly. "Why did he not come to me?" "Because he is terrified of disappointing you," Victoria cried, squeezing my hands. "The cartel knows who you are. They know about the company. They are planning to come after the corporate assets to settle his debt. Derek found out about it last month. We tried to fix it without giving you a heart attack. You know what your doctor said about your blood pressure. I could not let this stress kill you." She wiped her eyes, taking a shaky breath, trying to look like a brave martyr. "Derek came up with a legal maneuver, an asset protection strategy. If I file for divorce and we transfer the house, the cars, and the company entirely into my name, it creates a legal firewall. We sever Lucas from the family trust completely. On paper, he will have absolutely nothing, and he will not be tied to the corporate empire. When the cartel tries to seize his assets, they will hit a brick wall. I am taking it all on paper to save our empire, William. We have to be ruthless to save our boy. I looked at the tears streaming down her face. The logic was twisted, but to a desperate, uninformed father, it might have sounded plausible. It was the perfect lie. It preyed on my love for my son and my instinct to protect my business. She was painting herself as the ultimate savior, willing to take on the burden of a fake divorce just to shield us from ruin. If I had not seen Derek's arrogant smirk during the toast, I might have fallen for it. But I knew the truth. They were not trying to save Lucas. They were trying to bankrupt him so he could never afford a lawyer to challenge them for the company. I needed her to believe that her manipulation had worked. I needed her to feel completely safe and victorious. If I exposed her lie right now, Derek would start draining the corporate accounts by morning. I had to play the game. I let out a long, shuddering breath. I let my shoulders slump, releasing all the tension in my body. I raised my hands and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. I pulled her into a tight embrace, burying my face in her hair. "My God, Victoria," I whispered, injecting a fake tremor into my voice. "I had no idea. I am so sorry I doubted you. You are right. We have to do whatever it takes to protect him. We will follow Derek's plan. We will save our son." She let out a heavy sigh of relief, wrapping her arms around my neck. "I love you, William. Everything is going to be fine. Just let Derek handle the paperwork. Trust us." "I do." I lied softly. "I trust you completely." We held each other in the dark cabin of the truck. She was playing the relieved wife, and I was playing the grateful husband. We were two completely different people trapped in a marriage that had just become a battlefield. As I held her holding the woman who was actively plotting my total ruin, I felt a slight vibration against my chest. My cell phone tucked inside the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket buzzed once. Then it buzzed again. A short, sharp, double vibration. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the phone. "Just a message from the club manager," I murmured. I glanced down. It was an automated security alert from our primary offshore reserve bank in the Cayman Islands. The text was devastatingly clear. It read, "Primary account access privileges for William Gallagher have been permanently revoked by Chief Financial Officer Derek Vance." The war was no longer approaching. It had already arrived, and my enemies had fired the first devastating shot. I did not sleep for a single moment that night. I lay awake in the absolute darkness of our bedroom. Victoria rested peacefully beside me under the warm silk sheets. She was completely untroubled by the massive betrayal she had started. I simply stared at the ceiling until the morning light appeared. My mind was rapidly calculating every risk and every single countermeasure. That sudden automated alert from the offshore bank was incredibly revealing. Derek was already moving his pieces forward on the corporate chessboard. He was locking me out of my own liquid assets before the paperwork was served. However, my enemies had made one truly massive, fatal miscalculation. They incorrectly assumed I would be completely paralyzed by sudden heartbreak. They somehow forgot my history before I became a wealthy businessman. Long before I wore expensive suits, I was a relentless street fighter. At exactly 4 a.m, I quietly left the warm bed. I walked silently down the long hallway toward my private dressing room. I completely bypassed the long rows of expensive Italian leather shoes. Instead, I quickly reached into the very back of the deep closet to find my oldest work clothes and heavy boots. I put on my faded denim jeans and a simple flannel shirt. I laced up my heavy steel-toed work boots with focused determination. I exited the massive mansion through a quiet side security door. The cool morning air felt incredibly refreshing against my tired face. I walked slowly across the gravel driveway toward my old pickup truck. I climbed into the familiar driver's seat and turned the metal key. The old engine roared to life with a comforting, familiar sound. I drove away from the wealthy neighborhood and headed straight toward the gritty southern industrial district of Dallas, Texas. 40 years ago, I personally poured the thick concrete foundation for my very first logistics yard, right there on that exact barren plot of dirt. I built those original loading docks with my own 2 hands. I still knew every single inch of that sprawling industrial facility. I clearly remembered the heavy smell of the raw diesel exhaust. I intentionally placed Lucas in that specific warehouse to work as a junior floor manager. I wanted my only son to truly learn the family business from the absolute bottom up, so he could earn genuine respect from all our hardworking workers. When I pulled through the main security gates of the southern yard, it was exactly 5 in the morning. The massive industrial floodlights brightly illuminated the entire outdoor parking lot. The overnight warehouse shift was just beginning to slowly wrap up. Heavy transport trucks were rumbling loudly past the small guard shack. They were hauling massive freight containers out onto the busy interstate highway. I parked my old truck near the main administrative office building. I started walking quietly toward the crowded employee parking section. I expected to safely find Lucas inside the massive warehouse checking the daily freight manifest. Instead of finding him working inside, I spotted his personal vehicle. It was a modest 5-year-old sedan parked in the furthest corner of the employee lot. The windows were slightly fogged from the freezing early morning temperature. I walked directly over to the driver's side window and peered inside the car. My heart immediately sank into the pit of my stomach. Lucas was fast asleep in the reclined driver's seat. He was wearing his bright yellow safety vest over a dirty gray sweatshirt. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest to keep his shivering body very warm. He looked utterly exhausted and completely drained of all human energy. There were incredibly deep, dark circles under his closed, sleeping eyes. His face was unusually pale and deeply drawn from severe physical exhaustion. This was definitely not the face of a degenerate gambler who owed millions of dollars to a violent criminal cartel. This was clearly the face of a desperate, broken man trying to survive another difficult day. I tapped gently on the cold glass window. Lucas jolted awake instantly in sudden panic. He fumbled frantically for the interior door handle until he finally recognized my older face. The sudden panic slowly faded into a look of deep personal shame. He rolled down the window, and freezing air rushed inside the cabin. He rubbed his tired eyes and sat up perfectly straight in his seat. He nervously asked what I was doing there so incredibly early. I opened his car door and told him to step outside immediately. He climbed out slowly and shivered in the cold morning wind. I asked him why he was sleeping outside in a freezing car instead of actively managing the warehouse floor inside. He looked down at the concrete pavement completely silently. He explained that he just needed a very quick power nap. He confessed that he picked up several extra manual labor night shifts on the loading dock this week to earn basic overtime pay. He was simply too exhausted to drive all the way back home safely. I placed my hand gently on his tired shoulder and felt how incredibly thin he had suddenly become. I asked him why he was working brutal extra night shifts when his regular management salary was more than enough to support his pregnant wife comfortably. His jaw tightened as he looked away very sadly. He took a deep, shaky breath and finally looked back into my eyes. His expression was completely filled with profound sadness and desperate fear. He whispered that his mother had completely cut off his corporate salary exactly 3 months ago. He explained that Victoria told him the company was facing imminent total bankruptcy. She claimed I was drowning in severe financial stress and too incredibly proud to ask for outside help. She completely froze his employee payroll access and locked his emergency trust fund without warning. She insisted everyone had to tighten their belts to save my failing poor life. He cried softly as he explained that Rachel had severe pregnancy complications. Her specialist medical bills were piling up very rapidly, and basic insurance refused to cover them. Victoria strictly forbade him from bothering me with his urgent financial problems. She claimed the added stress would immediately trigger my fatal heart attack. So my desperate son begged his yard supervisor for off-the-books manual labor shifts. He was working 18 hours a day just to pay for a doctor. Victoria was deliberately starving her own child to force him into absolute poverty before the pending divorce proceedings officially started. I pulled my crying son into a tight and fierce paternal embrace. I let him release all the terrible pain his mother had intentionally caused. I looked him right in the eye and told him the absolute truth. I told him the company was incredibly profitable and his mother had lied to destroy him. I told him to go home to Rachel and completely ignore his mother. I promised I would utterly destroy everyone who had hurt him. I walked back to my truck and drove directly toward the massive corporate headquarters building. The brutal corporate war had officially begun. I drove straight to the corporate headquarters that morning. I marched into the executive suite, fully intending to rip the master financial ledgers right out of Derek's treacherous hands. But my chief financial officer was already waiting for me. He was hiding cowardly behind a freshly printed board resolution, completely signed and authorized by Victoria. They had legally blocked my administrative access to the main accounts pending the official divorce filing. I did not scream. I did not throw a single punch. I simply turned around, walked down to the basement server room, and found a quiet technician I had personally put through night school 5 years ago. Within 20 minutes, he had built me an untraceable digital backdoor into Derek's computer. I had my digital key. Now I desperately needed the physical proof. I returned to my sprawling estate later that evening. I walked through the massive front doors, moving slower than usual. I let my broad shoulders slump heavily. I rubbed the center of my chest occasionally perfectly, playing the role of a physically broken, completely overwhelmed old man. Victoria was sitting elegantly in the formal living room, sipping a delicate glass of white wine while browsing through a high-end fashion magazine. I sat down heavily in the leather armchair right across from her. I let out a long, ragged sigh that echoed in the quiet room. I told her the immense stress of Lucas and his supposed cartel debt, combined with the brutal corporate lockdown, was physically destroying my failing heart. I told her my chest was burning constantly, and my left arm felt entirely numb. I said my private physician had strongly recommended an emergency, completely disconnected cardiac retreat in Sedona, Arizona. 2 weeks of absolute silence, no cell phones, no internet, and absolutely no corporate stress. Victoria slowly looked up from her glossy magazine. For a fleeting second, I saw a terrifying flash of pure, unadulterated joy light up her eyes. The incredible idea of me being completely out of the picture, isolated in a remote desert medical facility without any outside communication, was the absolute greatest gift I could possibly hand her. But she quickly masked her evil excitement with a practiced look of deep, loving, wifely concern. She rushed over to my chair, knelt gently beside me, and placed her soft, manicured hands on my tired knees. She warmly insisted that my physical health was the absolute most important thing in the whole world. She promised she would handle the ruthless lawyers, she would handle Derek, and she would somehow manage the terrible situation with Lucas, while I rested my failing heart. She was so incredibly eager to get rid of me that she personally went upstairs and packed my heavy leather travel bags herself. The very next morning, my private driver loaded my luggage into the trunk of the black town car. Victoria stood on the grand front steps of our expensive estate wearing a plush cashmere sweater, waving goodbye with a perfectly practiced look of deep devotion. I waved back, looking like a tired, beaten old man, completely surrendering to his physical limits. The quiet driver took me directly to the private aviation terminal at the Dallas International Airport. I walked slowly through the sliding front doors of the terminal, waited exactly 15 minutes in the lobby, and then walked right out the back exit. I did not board any private flight to Arizona. Instead, I climbed into a rented, unremarkable gray sedan that was waiting for me in the short-term parking lot. I drove exactly 10 miles away from my wealthy, manicured neighborhood to a rundown, dingy motel located right off a noisy, polluted industrial highway. I paid for the room in untraceable cash. Once I was safely inside the cramped, dark motel room, I made a highly secured phone call. I reached out to an elite private covert operations team run by a former federal intelligence agent. I paid them a massive sum of money for immediate, absolutely discreet service. Within a single hour, under the clever guise of a routine premium cable television repair crew, they successfully infiltrated my estate. Because my name was still legally registered on the property deed, It was entirely legal for me to authorize the covert installation of hidden security devices inside my own home. They expertly wired the master bedroom, the formal living room, and the private home office. They carefully placed microscopic cameras deep inside the air vents behind the wooden crown molding and within the custom library bookshelves. By 6 o'clock that evening, the covert tactical team had securely transmitted the heavily encrypted feed directly to a cheap, scuffed laptop I had set up on the stained wooden desk in my motel room. I sat entirely alone in the dim, flickering light, completely surrounded by peeling yellow wallpaper and the loud rumbling sound of passing cargo trucks on the nearby highway. I opened a greasy cardboard box of cheap, stale delivery pizza. It was a stark, depressing contrast to the millions of dollars I possessed, but my appetite for fine luxury was entirely gone. I was only hungry for the absolute brutal truth. I clicked the secure application open. The high-definition live video feed of my own luxury estate instantly filled the glowing computer screen. The massive house was completely silent and still. I watched the digital clock on the bottom right corner of the video feed slowly tick forward. Exactly 2 hours after I supposedly boarded a private jet to a remote Arizona desert, the heavy oak front doors of my mansion swung wide open. Derek Vance, my trusted chief financial officer, casually strolled right into my home. He did not bother to knock. He used his own personal silver key. He walked with an incredibly arrogant, relaxed stride directly up the grand, sweeping staircase. I quickly switched the camera view to the master bedroom, my private bedroom. Victoria was already waiting there. She was wearing a sheer, expensive silk robe. She smiled radiantly as Derek entered the room, casually tossing his tailored suit jacket over my favorite leather reading chair. She walked gracefully over to the bedside table, picked up a chilled bottle of imported French champagne, and slowly poured 2 overflowing glasses. They raised their glasses high in the air, clinking them together in a silent, arrogant toast to their perceived ultimate victory. I watched my wife lean forward and press her lips passionately against the man I had personally mentored and treated like a second son for 20 long years. The reality of their betrayal washed over me in a cold, unforgiving wave. They were not merely satisfied with stealing my entire corporate empire and completely destroying my biological son. They were actively celebrating my deliberate destruction on the very mattress where I had slept peacefully for 3 decades. I sat perfectly still in that freezing, dirty motel room, chewing a tasteless piece of cold pizza. I did not shed a single tear. I simply stared at the glowing computer monitor as the ultimate depth of their treachery was finally revealed. The trap was perfectly set. The greedy rats had happily walked right inside. I sat completely motionless in that dimly lit motel room. The glowing screen of the laptop was the only source of light illuminating the peeling yellow wallpaper and the severely stained carpet around me. The air smelled of cheap bleach and old cigarette smoke, a stark, depressing contrast to the millions of dollars I commanded in my daily life. On the monitor, the high-definition feed from my own master bedroom continued to broadcast the ultimate betrayal. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent building the Gallagher Corporation from absolute scratch. I remembered the freezing winters and scorching Texas summers pouring heavy concrete until my hands physically bled. I did it all to secure a permanent legacy for my family. Victoria and Derek had just finished their arrogant champagne toast. I watched them laugh together with a sickening ease. It was not just the physical affair that made my blood run cold. Physical infidelity is a deeply painful personal wound, but what I was about to witness was a calculated, cold-blooded execution of my entire life's work. Derek set his empty crystal glass on the polished oak nightstand. He walked over to the heavy leather briefcase he had tossed on the floor earlier. The very same briefcase I had seen Victoria slip that thick envelope into during my 70th birthday gala. He placed the briefcase squarely on the center of my bed. He popped the golden latches open. The sharp metallic click echoed loudly through the hidden microphones. He reached inside and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents and wide rolled-up architectural blueprints. Victoria wrapped her sheer silk robe tightly around her waist and crawled gracefully to the center of the mattress. She looked at the scattered papers with a hungry, predatory intensity that I had never seen before in all our 30 years of marriage. Derek unrolled the large blueprints and flattened them out across the expensive silk sheets. I leaned much closer to the dirty motel desk, staring intently at the computer monitor. My eyes quickly scanned the blurry text on the blueprints. I recognized the distinct geographic layout immediately. It was the Red Creek Tract. This was a massive 500-acre plot of raw industrial land located on the far western edge of the Dallas County line. I knew that property extremely well. It had been sitting completely abandoned and entirely useless for decades. The local zoning boards had always warned commercial developers away from that specific region. The soil was notoriously unstable for heavy concrete foundations, and the surrounding infrastructure was practically non-existent. I had personally passed on buying that exact plot of dirt 3 different times because it was a terrible location for standard freight logistics. But Derek was pointing at the map with frantic, excited energy. He tapped his finger directly on the center of the printed property lines, grinning broadly like a man who had just struck absolute oil. He looked at my wife and proudly announced that the final massive wire transfers had officially cleared the offshore accounts early that morning. He explained that they had successfully drained 90% of our company's available liquid cash reserves to purchase the entire 500-acre parcel outright. I felt a sudden, sharp pain tighten in my chest. He had completely bypassed the corporate board of directors. He had bypassed my strict financial oversight entirely. He was bleeding my logistics empire completely dry. Victoria smiled radiantly and asked him how he managed to authorize such a massive multi-million-dollar land acquisition without triggering a single bank alarm or alerting my personal legal team. Derek let out a low, confident laugh. He reached into the pile of papers and held up a final commercial purchase agreement. Even through the grainy camera feed, I could clearly see the dark blue ink at the bottom of the final page. It was my signature. My exact, perfectly replicated, legally authorized signature. Derek had carefully forged my name on dozens of binding federal financial documents to secretly drain my corporate liquidity. He had abused the absolute trust I placed in him when I hired him as a clueless intern 20 years ago. I taught him how to navigate the banking world, and he used my own lessons to destroy me. This was no longer just a ruthless divorce strategy. This was absolute, undeniable corporate treason. Victoria traced her manicured finger over the forged signature and praised his brilliant work. She did not show a single ounce of remorse for stealing the money I had bled for. She asked him to explain the next phase of their grand plan. Derek leaned back against the heavy headboard of my bed and outlined a strategy so incredibly vicious, it took my breath away. He explained that by secretly purchasing the Red Creek Tract, they were going to artificially inflate the overall valuation of the Gallagher Corporation on paper. He had secretly negotiated a backroom deal with a massive international technology giant who desperately needed a sprawling 500-acre campus for a new regional data center. The tech company was willing to pay an astronomical premium for a massive plot of undeveloped Texas land. As soon as Victoria secured 100% absolute ownership of the entire company in the final divorce settlement, they were going to flip the newly acquired Red Creek Tract to the tech giant for triple the original purchase price. They were going to walk away with hundreds of millions of dollars in clean, untraceable profit. It was a flawless, devastating corporate takeover executed from the inside out. They had thought of absolutely everything covering their tracks, with layers of fake legal maneuvers and hidden shell corporations. They were using my money to buy the land, my forged signature, to secure the deal, and my divorce to steal the ultimate payout. I listened to every single word with a terrifying, absolute clarity. Victoria smiled warmly at the thought of her impending massive fortune. She then asked what would happen to me when the dust finally settled. She asked what would happen to Lucas, her own flesh and blood, when the company was permanently liquidated and sold off to the tech billionaires. Victoria did not flinch. She did not shed a single tear for the son she had carried in her womb. She simply nodded in quiet agreement, perfectly willing to sacrifice her own child for an offshore bank account. Derek poured himself another generous glass of my expensive champagne. He took a long, slow sip and looked around my beautiful master bedroom with a look of supreme, untouchable arrogance. He let out a dark, cruel laugh that sent cold shivers down my spine. He told her that once the judge signs the final decree, the old man will be left with absolutely nothing but his rusty pickup truck, and your son will be permanently bankrupt. Victoria asked what they would do if I somehow figured it out and tried to fight back in court. Derek simply smiled, looked directly at the hidden camera without realizing it, and said, "If William fights back, I will release the doctored tax files to the IRS." I sat completely motionless in that dimly lit motel room. The glowing screen of the laptop was the only source of light illuminating the peeling yellow wallpaper and the severely stained carpet around me. The air smelled of cheap bleach and old cigarette smoke, a stark, depressing contrast to the millions of dollars I commanded in my daily life. On the monitor, the high-definition feed from my own master bedroom continued to broadcast the ultimate betrayal. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent building the Gallagher Corporation from absolute scratch. I remembered the freezing winters and scorching Texas summers pouring heavy concrete until my hands physically bled. I did it all to secure a permanent legacy for my family. Victoria and Derek had just finished their highly arrogant champagne toast. I watched them laugh together with a sickening ease. It was not just the brutal physical affair that made my blood run cold. Physical infidelity is a deeply painful personal wound, but what I was about to witness was a calculated cold-blooded execution of my entire life's work. Derek set his empty crystal glass on the polished oak nightstand. He walked over to the heavy leather briefcase he had tossed on the floor earlier. The very same briefcase I had seen Victoria slip that thick envelope into during my 70th birthday gala. He placed the briefcase squarely on the center of my bed. He popped the golden latches open. The sharp, metallic click echoed loudly through the hidden microphones. He reached inside and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents and wide, rolled-up architectural blueprints. Victoria wrapped her sheer silk robe tightly around her waist and crawled gracefully to the center of the mattress. She looked at the scattered papers with a hungry, predatory intensity that I had never seen before in all our 30 years of marriage. Derek unrolled the large blueprints and flattened them out across the expensive silk sheets. I leaned much closer to the dirty motel desk, staring intently at the computer monitor. My eyes quickly scanned the blurry text on the blueprints. I recognized the distinct geographic layout immediately. It was the Red Creek Tract. This was a massive 500-acre plot of raw industrial land located on the far western edge of the Dallas County line. I knew that property extremely well. It had been sitting completely abandoned and entirely useless for decades. The local zoning boards had always warned commercial developers away from that specific region. The soil was notoriously unstable for heavy concrete foundations, and the surrounding infrastructure was practically non-existent. I had personally passed on buying that exact plot of dirt 3 times because it was a terrible location for standard freight logistics. But Derek was pointing at the map with frantic, excited energy. He tapped his finger directly on the center of the printed property lines, grinning broadly, like a man who had just struck absolute oil. He looked at my wife and proudly announced that the final massive wire transfers had officially cleared the offshore accounts early that morning. He explained that they had successfully drained 90% of our company's available liquid cash reserves to purchase the entire 500-acre parcel outright. I felt a sudden, sharp pain tighten in my chest. He had completely bypassed the corporate board of directors. He had bypassed my strict financial oversight entirely. He was bleeding my logistics empire completely dry. Victoria smiled radiantly and asked him how he managed to authorize such a massive multi-million-dollar land acquisition without triggering a single bank alarm or alerting my personal legal team. Derek let out a low, confident laugh. He reached into the pile of papers and held up a final commercial purchase agreement. Even through the grainy camera feed, I could clearly see the dark blue ink at the bottom of the final page. It was my signature, my exact, perfectly replicated, legally authorized signature. Derek had carefully forged my name on dozens of binding federal financial documents to secretly drain my corporate liquidity. He had abused the absolute trust I placed in him when I hired him as a clueless intern 20 years ago. I taught him how to navigate the banking world, and he used my own lessons to destroy me. This was no longer just a ruthless divorce strategy. This was absolute, undeniable corporate treason. Victoria traced her manicured finger over the forged signature and praised his brilliant work. She simply did not show a single ounce of remorse for stealing the money I had bled for. She asked him to explain the very next phase of their grand plan. Derek leaned back against the heavy headboard of my bed and outlined a strategy so vicious it took my breath away. He explained that by secretly purchasing the Red Creek tract, they were going to artificially inflate the overall valuation of the Gallagher Corporation on paper. He negotiated a backroom deal with a massive international technology giant who desperately needed a sprawling 500-acre campus for a new regional data center. The tech company was willing to pay an astronomical premium for a massive plot of undeveloped Texas land. As soon as Victoria secured 100% absolute ownership of the company in the final divorce settlement, they were going to flip the newly acquired Red Creek tract to the tech giant for triple the original purchase price. They were going to walk away with hundreds of millions of dollars in untraceable profit. It was a flawless, devastating corporate takeover executed from the inside out. They had thought of absolutely everything covering their tracks with layers of fake legal maneuvers and hidden shell corporations. They were using my money to buy the land, my forged signature to secure the deal, and my divorce to steal the ultimate payout. I listened to every single word with a terrifying, absolute clarity. Victoria smiled warmly at the thought of her impending massive fortune. She then asked what would happen to me when the dust finally settled. She asked what would happen to Lucas, her own flesh and blood, when the company was permanently liquidated and sold off to the tech billionaires. Victoria did not flinch. She did not shed a single tear for the son she had carried in her womb. She simply nodded in quiet agreement, perfectly willing to sacrifice her own child for an offshore bank account. Derek poured himself another generous glass of my expensive champagne. He took a long, slow sip and looked around my beautiful master bedroom with a look of supreme, untouchable arrogance. He let out a dark laugh that sent cold shivers down my spine. He told her that once the judge signs the final decree, the old man will be left with absolutely nothing but his rusty pickup truck, and your son will be permanently bankrupt. Victoria asked what they would do if I somehow figured it out, and tried to fight back in court. Derek simply smiled, looked directly right at the hidden camera without realizing it, and said, "If William fights back, I will release the doctored tax files to the IRS." Hearing that chilling threat to use doctored tax files against me finally broke whatever remaining patience I had left. I packed up the cheap laptop and walked out of that depressing motel room before the sun even started to rise. I knew I needed absolute leverage to counter their blackmail. Later that very same morning, I intercepted my pregnant daughter-in-law, Rachel, outside her private medical clinic. She was terrified and broke down in tears the moment she saw me. She confessed that Victoria had viciously threatened to frame Lucas for corporate embezzlement and send him to federal prison unless Rachel forced him to cut all ties with me. But Rachel was fiercely loyal. Her hands were trembling violently when she reached into her coat pocket and handed me a small silver flash drive. She whispered that she had managed to secretly steal it from Victoria's designer purse when she was not looking. She had no idea what was on it, but she knew Victoria guarded it with her life. I hugged Rachel, promised her that nobody was going to prison, and drove straight to the towering glass skyscraper located in downtown Dallas. I walked past the polished reception desk and marched directly into the expansive corner office of Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was my ruthless corporate attorney. He was an incredibly sharp, uncompromising legal mind who had defended my business interests for over 15 years. I locked his heavy mahogany office door behind me and dropped the small silver flash drive directly onto his pristine glass desk. I told him we had a massive corporate emergency and I needed him to drop absolutely everything else immediately. He saw the cold, dead, serious look in my eyes and did not ask a single question. He simply nodded, plugged the silver device into his encrypted computer terminal, and quickly bypassed the basic password protection. The digital folders opened instantly on his massive flat-screen monitor. The files were not doctored tax documents or secret offshore banking ledgers. They were highly classified environmental soil reports and deeply detailed geological surveys specifically covering the Red Creek Tract. This was the exact same 500-acre plot of raw industrial land that Derek and Victoria had just purchased using my severely depleted corporate cash reserves. Jonathan began scrolling slowly through the dense hundreds of pages of highly technical jargon. He was a brilliant legal mind, but he did not understand the complex chemical data flashing across the screen. He muttered that it simply looked like standard undeveloped commercial real estate zoning paperwork. But I was not just a corporate executive in a tailored suit. I was a veteran construction worker who had spent 40 years digging deep into the unpredictable Texas dirt. I knew the subtle difference between clean industrial soil and completely corrupted earth. I walked around his desk and leaned closely over his shoulder, my eyes scanning the long columns of chemical markers and highly elevated subterranean toxicity levels. I felt the color drain completely out of my face. I pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at the digital screen, highlighting a specific series of extremely dense chemical compounds and heavy metal concentrations buried deep within the soil sample results. I explained to Jonathan exactly what we were looking at. I told him the horrific history of that specific Western County borderline. Back in the late 1970s, long before strict federal environmental regulations existed, that isolated area was frequently used as a massive, undocumented, and completely illegal toxic waste dumping ground by several corrupt chemical manufacturing companies. The local government eventually buried the toxic history, and the dangerous land sat entirely abandoned for decades. Any experienced commercial developer in Dallas knew to stay completely away from the Red Creek Tract. The soil was so deeply contaminated with severe industrial toxins and leaking chemical drums that the groundwater was completely ruined. Derek and Victoria thought they had cleverly bypassed the open market to steal a hidden real estate gold mine. They foolishly believed they were going to easily flip the massive property to an international technology giant for triple the original purchase price. But they were arrogant and completely blinded by their own limitless greed. They had secretly bribed a corrupt local land surveyor to intentionally hide these exact, devastating environmental reports so they could rapidly fast-track the massive corporate purchase. They desperately wanted to lock down the land before the impending divorce proceedings officially finalized. They had absolutely no idea they had just used my stolen corporate money to purchase a massive, leaking, toxic bomb. Jonathan stared at the glowing monitor, with a look of absolute horror dawning on his sharp face. The legal implications of this discovery were completely catastrophic. In the United States commercial real estate market, severe environmental liability directly follows the current chain of ownership. If you buy the poisoned land, you legally buy the toxic problem, regardless of who originally dumped the dangerous chemicals 40 years ago. Jonathan quickly picked up his secure desk phone and dialed a highly confidential private contact he maintained deep inside the Federal Environmental Protection Agency in Washington. He placed the phone on speaker and kept his voice extremely low and professional. He asked his federal contact to secretly search the internal database for any pending regulatory actions specifically targeting the Red Creek Tract in western Dallas. We waited in agonizing, suffocating silence for what felt like hours, listening to the muffled sound of a computer keyboard clacking on the other end of the secure line. Finally, the federal agent's voice crackled through the speakerphone. The agent sounded incredibly tense. He explained that the Environmental Protection Agency was not just passively looking into that specific property. The federal government had already completed a massive secret investigation, and they were currently preparing to issue an aggressive, non-negotiable federal mandate. The official mandate was scheduled to be publicly released in less than 3 months. The agent explained the brutal legal reality. Whoever legally owned the Gallagher Corporation when the federal mandate finally hit the public record would be immediately and legally forced to orchestrate a complete top-to-bottom environmental excavation and hazardous soil remediation. The government would instantly freeze all associated corporate assets until the dangerous property was completely cleaned to strict federal standards. Jonathan swallowed hard and asked the agent for the internal estimated cost of the mandatory toxic cleanup operation. The agent paused for a heavy, terrifying moment before delivering the final, devastating blow. He stated clearly that the sheer volume of buried hazardous waste and the severe depth of the groundwater contamination made this a nightmare scenario. The estimated mandatory cleanup cost was exactly $90 million. The secure phone line went completely dead. The heavy, suffocating silence in Jonathan's corner office was absolutely deafening. I slowly backed away from the bright computer monitor and sat down heavily in a dark leather chair. My heart pounded wildly against my ribs as the realization set in. $90 million. It was an apocalyptic, inescapable financial death sentence. Whoever legally owned the entire company when that massive federal mandate finally hit the public record was going to be permanently finished. The secure phone line went completely dead, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence hanging in the air of the corner office. I slowly backed away from the bright computer monitor and sank deeply into the dark leather guest chair. My heart was pounding wildly against my ribs, but my mind was moving with a terrifying, absolute clarity. $90 million. That was the crushing, apocalyptic number the federal agent had just delivered. The United States government was actively preparing to drop an inescapable financial death sentence directly onto the Gallagher Corporation. Whoever held the legal ownership titles when that federal mandate finally hit the public record would be instantly wiped out. Their personal assets would be completely frozen, their bank accounts seized, and their entire life ruined by the merciless enforcement of federal environmental laws. I sat perfectly still, staring at the glossy mahogany desk as the scattered puzzle pieces of my wife's brutal betrayal finally locked together into a perfectly clear picture. Derek was an incredibly arrogant man, but he was ultimately just a glorified accountant. He spent his entire career sitting comfortably behind a sleek desk, staring at clean digital spreadsheets and safe corporate profit margins. He had absolutely no practical experience working with raw dirt. He had no real understanding of the dark physical history buried deep beneath the Texas soil. He saw a massive 500-acre plot of undeveloped commercial land located dangerously close to a major metropolitan highway, and he only saw a golden ticket. He saw the ultimate bait for a wealthy international technology giant looking to build a massive new data center. In his blind, desperate greed to secure the land before the impending divorce proceedings officially began, Derek had actively bypassed every standard safety protocol I had ever established. He must have secretly bribed a corrupt local land surveyor to intentionally bury those old 1970s chemical toxicity reports. He deliberately hid the dangerous environmental warnings so he could rapidly fast-track the massive corporate purchase using my forged signature. He foolishly thought he was bypassing the open real estate market to steal an absolute goldmine. He had absolutely no idea that he had just used my stolen corporate cash reserves to purchase a leaking, highly toxic bomb. And the timer on that bomb was ticking down fast. Jonathan began pacing frantically back and forth across his expansive office. His sharp leather shoes tapped loudly against the hardwood floor. He was a brilliant, aggressive corporate attorney, and his immediate instinct was to launch a massive legal counterattack. He stopped pacing, leaned over his desk, and told me we needed to file an emergency federal injunction right this second. He wanted to immediately freeze all the corporate accounts, contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and have Derek arrested for severe wire fraud and felony signature forgery. He insisted that if we exposed the illicit land acquisition right now, we could legally invalidate the commercial purchase and desperately try to force the original sellers to take the poisoned land back. I listened to my trusted lawyer ramble nervously, but I slowly shook my head. I looked out the towering glass windows at the bright, bustling Dallas skyline. I told Jonathan to stop and think about the brutal reality of our current legal situation. If I blew the whistle and exposed Derek right now, the entire Gallagher Corporation would be instantly paralyzed by a massive, highly public criminal investigation. The Federal Environmental Protection Agency would immediately accelerate their timeline. They would not care about a messy domestic divorce or a forged corporate signature. They only cared about who currently owned the severely contaminated property. The legal battle to reverse the land purchase would easily take a decade of agonizing litigation. In the meantime, the federal government would officially brand my company as a severe environmental hazard. They would seize everything I had spent 40 years building to pay for the immediate chemical excavation. I looked back at Jonathan and explained that if I fought my wife in open court right now, I would simply be fighting for the absolute privilege of keeping a bankrupt, federally condemned corporate empire. I would spend the rest of my natural life drowning in impossible debt, fighting vicious government lawyers, and watching my proud family legacy turn into toxic ash. I refused to let that happen. I had worked too many brutal 16-hour days pouring heavy concrete to watch my company die on my watch. A cold, deeply calculated sense of calm washed over my tired body. In the grueling commercial construction business, I had learned a very harsh, unforgiving lesson. Sometimes when a massive building is deeply compromised by severe structural rot, you cannot simply patch the cracks and hope for the best. You have to step back, rig the explosives, and let the entire condemned structure collapse in on itself to save the surrounding properties. Victoria and Derek wanted to steal my empire. They were incredibly hungry, deeply arrogant, and completely blinded by their own vicious greed. They wanted to leave me with absolutely nothing. I realized in that quiet moment that their ruthless, unforgiving greed was actually the greatest weapon I possessed. I did not need to fight them. I simply needed to step entirely out of their way and politely open the door to their own destruction. I stood up from the dark leather chair. I walked over to the mahogany desk and looked Jonathan directly in his eyes. I told him to completely forget about the federal injunctions. I told him to forget about calling the federal authorities. I instructed him to sit down at his encrypted computer and immediately start drafting the final divorce settlement paperwork. Jonathan stared at me as if I had completely lost my mind. He asked me what I was talking about. He reminded me that Victoria was demanding 100% absolute ownership of the entire corporate portfolio, the massive private estates, and the luxury vehicles. He begged me not to surrender my entire life's work to a woman who was actively trying to destroy my only son. I placed my hands on his desk. I leaned forward, keeping my voice incredibly steady, completely devoid of any fear or hesitation. I told my lawyer to give her absolutely everything she asked for. I instructed him to draft the legal papers transferring 100% of the Gallagher Corporation directly into Victoria's name. I told him to give her the sprawling mansion, the expensive cars, and the entire corporate fleet. But I looked at Jonathan with a cold, unwavering intensity and gave him my final, absolute condition. I told him to bury a very specific clause deep inside the final settlement paperwork. I want an ironclad, completely inflexible indemnity clause. By signing that final divorce decree, she must legally assume all corporate liabilities, past, present, and future, without any possible exceptions whatsoever. I want her to look at me in that courtroom and believe she has completely defeated me. I want her to feel absolutely invincible right up until the exact second the federal government comes knocking on her grand front door to collect their massive, inescapable financial debt. I spent 3 more days in that depressing motel room, allowing my physical appearance to rapidly deteriorate. I barely slept intentionally, letting deep, dark circles form under my eyes. When I finally drove my old pickup truck back through the heavy wrought iron gates of my Dallas estate, I made sure my shoulders were severely slumped. I walked up the grand stone steps with a slow, deliberate limp. I truly needed Victoria and Derek to fully believe they broke me today. I pushed the heavy mahogany front doors open. The massive house was completely silent. I shuffled slowly into the formal living room. Victoria was sitting gracefully on the expensive white sofa, wearing a perfectly tailored designer suit. Derek was standing right behind her, leaning casually against the marble fireplace with his arms crossed. They had a thick stack of legal documents resting on the glass coffee table between them. I let out a long, ragged breath and leaned heavily against the wooden doorframe, clutching the left side of my chest. Victoria looked up at me with a completely blank, icy expression. She told me her attorneys had finished drafting the final divorce settlement. She told me I had exactly 24 hours to pack my personal clothing and vacate the premises forever. I was absolutely certain of my victory now. I let my knees buckle just a little bit. I stumbled forward and collapsed heavily into the armchair across from them. I buried my face in my rough, calloused hands. I looked up at her with moisture welling in my eyes. I begged her to reconsider. I pleaded with her to let me keep just 20% of the commercial logistics division so I could have something to leave behind when I died. Derek let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He looked down at me with absolute sickening pity. He told me that I no longer had any leverage to negotiate. He claimed my outdated leadership was holding the company back, and they were finally taking it into the modern era. I looked at the man I had personally mentored for 2 decades. I had paid for his wedding. I had visited his children in the hospital. And now he was standing in my own living room trying to strip away my entire legacy. I swallowed hard and focused my teary eyes back on my wife. I reached my shaking hands out toward Victoria. I pleaded for our son. I begged her to leave a small protected financial trust for Lucas. I reminded her that Rachel was pregnant with her very first grandchild. I told her Lucas was working brutal night shifts on the loading docks just to pay for basic medical care. I cried genuine tears for the suffering my boy was enduring. I asked her how she could possibly leave her own flesh and blood with absolutely nothing while she walked away with a $90 million empire. Victoria simply crossed her legs and adjusted her expensive silk blouse. She looked at me with a level of disgust that actually chilled my blood. She stated that Lucas needed to learn how to survive in the real world without a silver spoon in his mouth. She claimed she was doing him a massive favor by cutting him off completely. She said he was a weak, ungrateful child who needed to fail before he could ever succeed. She was entirely willing to let her pregnant daughter-in-law drown in medical debt just to secure her own massive fortune. The sheer, terrifying depth of her greed was absolutely staggering. I let out a loud, pathetic sob. I dropped my head back into my hands, shaking violently. I sobbed that they were taking my entire life. I cried that I would be left completely destitute, sleeping in my old truck, with absolutely nothing to show for 40 years of broken bones and bleeding hands. I begged them to show just a tiny shred of human mercy. I knew that the harder I begged to keep the company, the more desperately they would want to rip it away from me. I needed them to crave that final signature so badly that they would completely ignore the massive legal trap I was setting up for them. Victoria stood up from the white sofa. She walked over and stood directly over me, looking down at my shaking, defeated body. She was completely drunk on her own perceived power and overwhelming greed. She sneered at me with absolute unfiltered malice. She told me I was a pathetic, broken old man who had outlived his usefulness. She leaned down very close to my face, her voice dripping with venom. "You get nothing, William," she whispered sharply. "You sign these papers right now, or Derek goes straight to the federal authorities tomorrow morning with your supposed tax evasion. We will make sure you spend your final years rotting in a federal prison cell." I stared up at her cold, ruthless face. I let my hands shake uncontrollably. I breathed heavily, acting completely terrified of her vicious blackmail threat. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy black pen resting on the glass coffee table. I looked at Derek, who was grinning from ear to ear, already counting his imaginary millions. I looked at Victoria, who was watching me with triumphant, glowing eyes. I let out one final defeated sigh. I nodded my head slowly, letting the tears fall down my weathered cheeks. I told her I would sign the papers and surrender the entire empire under one strict condition. I demanded an absolute, non-negotiable indemnity clause to completely protect me from whatever tax fraud Derek was planning to frame me for. I told them she had to assume all corporate liabilities so I could finally walk away in absolute legal peace. Victoria laughed softly, completely eager to take the bait. She firmly believed I was just a terrified old man, desperately trying to avoid a fake prison sentence. She had absolutely no idea about the massive $90 million federal environmental mandate bearing down on the corporate assets. She looked at Derek, and he gave her a confident, approving nod. They both thought the indemnity clause was just my pathetic way of waving a white flag and securing a safe, cowardly retreat. They were so blinded by the immediate promise of hundreds of millions of dollars from the impending real estate flip that they completely failed to look underneath the surface of my legal request. Victoria proudly declared that she would gladly accept total liability for the company because I had mismanaged it for far too long anyway. She confidently promised to instruct her legal team to insert the absolute indemnity clause directly into the final divorce settlement before our official court hearing next week. I looked down at the floor, continuing to let my tired shoulders shake with fake, uncontrollable grief. I weakly whispered that I agreed to her brutal terms. They were finally walking right into my trap. I had successfully manipulated their endless greed today to lock them inside a burning building, and they had happily locked the doors themselves. As soon as I walked out of the heavy mahogany front doors of my sprawling estate, my entire physical demeanor instantly changed. I stopped shaking entirely. I straightened my tired back and pulled my shoulders back to their natural, proud posture. The pathetic, broken old man who had just sobbed uncontrollably in the formal living room completely vanished into the cool evening air. I climbed into my rusty pickup truck and turned the heavy ignition. I drove away from the manicured lawns and towering gates of the wealthy neighborhood without shedding a single tear. I had successfully sold the greatest performance of my entire life, and my arrogant enemies had eagerly bought every single second of it. Victoria and Derek were likely popping open another bottle of imported champagne right now, celebrating my supposed total surrender. They firmly believed I was driving away into absolute crushing poverty. In reality, I was driving directly toward the ultimate preservation of my true family legacy. I navigated the dark, quiet highways toward the northern edge of the sprawling city. I pulled into the dimly lit parking lot of an old 24-hour diner. It was a quiet place where tired truckers stopped for cheap coffee far away from the corporate spies and high society circles of Dallas. I parked my truck deep in the shadows and walked quietly inside. Lucas and Rachel were already sitting in a corner booth near the back of the empty restaurant. My son looked incredibly stressed, rubbing his tired temples with both hands. Rachel rested her hand gently on his broad shoulder, desperately trying to comfort him. They had undoubtedly heard the rapidly spreading vicious corporate rumors. The local legal circles were already whispering that William Gallagher had completely lost his mind and surrendered his entire $90 million empire to his ruthless wife without putting up a single fight. I walked over to their booth and slid quietly into the cracked vinyl seat across from them. Lucas looked up at me with eyes full of deep, agonizing sorrow. He sincerely thought I had sacrificed absolutely everything just to protect him from Victoria's vicious blackmail. He immediately started apologizing profusely, blaming himself and his supposed weakness for permanently costing me my entire life's work. I reached across the sticky laminate table and placed my heavy, calloused hand firmly over his shaking fingers. I told him to stop apologizing immediately. I looked at him with a calm, piercing intensity that instantly silenced his frantic, worried words. I told him that I had not lost a single solitary thing today. I gently explained that a wise builder never cries over a condemned building, especially when he is the exact person who secretly planted the heavy demolition charges right down in the dark basement. Rachel looked at me in absolute confusion. I leaned forward and lowered my rough voice to a quiet, steady whisper. I told them both the absolute unvarnished truth. I calmly explained every single dirty detail of the brutal betrayal I had uncovered. I told them about the hidden, dingy motel room, the covert micro-cameras, and the forged corporate financial signatures. I watched their faces turn white with horror as I detailed how Victoria and Derek secretly drained the corporate cash reserves to purchase the Red Creek tract. I patiently explained their arrogant master plan to deliberately inflate the company valuation, take full ownership in the impending divorce, and quickly flip the raw land to an international technology giant for hundreds of millions of dollars. Lucas clenched his rough hands into tight fists in pure, unadulterated anger, finally realizing the horrifying, unlimited extent of his own mother's endless greed. But then I smiled openly. A cold, deeply calculated, dangerous smile that made my son pause in surprise. I explained the massive, fatal flaw buried deep inside their brilliant master plan. I told him all about the secret environmental soil reports Rachel had bravely smuggled to me on that small silver flash drive. I slowly explained the terrifying, highly illegal history of the toxic waste dumping ground buried deep beneath their newly acquired commercial property. I watched Lucas's eyes widen with pure shock as I revealed the massive, inescapable $90 million federal mandate currently moving through the Environmental Protection Agency. I explained exactly why I had so happily surrendered the entire Gallagher Corporation this afternoon. I told them all about the absolute, completely non-negotiable indemnity clause I had aggressively forced Victoria to happily accept. I explained that she was not magically inheriting a golden real estate empire tomorrow. She was legally inheriting an apocalyptic, inescapable financial death sentence. Lucas sat completely stunned in the silent booth, slowly processing the sheer devastating magnitude of the massive legal trap. He finally realized I had not surrendered my legacy out of pathetic weakness. I had simply stepped completely out of the way of a speeding freight train and handed the steering wheel directly to my worst enemies. But then a sudden look of deep, profound worry briefly crossed his tired face. He quietly pointed out that while Victoria and Derek were certainly doomed, I was still walking away with absolutely nothing to my name. He truly thought I had sacrificed my own peaceful financial security just to execute this massive, highly vengeful punishment against his mother. I slowly shook my head side to side. I reached deep into my heavy canvas winter jacket and pulled out a thick, unmarked, heavy brown leather folder. I placed it gently onto the diner table and slid it directly across the smooth surface right to my waiting son. I told him to open it up right now. Lucas carefully untied the thick leather strap and slowly opened the heavy folder. Inside was a massive stack of immaculate, legally certified financial documents, originating directly from a highly secure, private offshore banking institution. I explained that long before the corporate mansions and the massive logistics fleets ever existed, I was just a hard-working man desperately trying to build a safe, impenetrable wall around my family. I had never truly trusted the wildly unpredictable nature of the commercial real estate market. For 40 long, grueling years, I had quietly and consistently funneled a solid portion of my clean, heavily taxed personal income into a hidden, legally bulletproof private trust. It was completely legally disconnected from the Gallagher Corporation and utterly invisible to Derek's greedy, manipulative accounting team. The documents clearly showed a perfectly preserved, entirely untouchable cash balance of exactly $15 million. Lucas stared at the numbers in disbelief. I explained that I transferred the entire $15 million trust into a new holding company. I pointed to the legal charter. It was entirely owned by Lucas Gallagher. I looked deeply into his emotional eyes. I told him a true legacy is never defined by concrete warehouses. True wealth is the integrity of your bloodline. Victoria wanted the rotting walls, but I was handing him the clean foundation to build a much better empire. Rachel cried tears of relief. He looked focused and ready to fight. He asked what happens in court tomorrow. I smiled coldly. Tomorrow we let the wolves eat the poisoned meat. The heavy morning sun rose over the sprawling skyline of Dallas. I stood outside the massive limestone pillars of the county courthouse. My tailored suit hung slightly loose on my aging physical frame. I made sure my dark silk tie was intentionally crooked today. I slouched my broad shoulders and let my hands tremble slightly. I was preparing to deliver the final act of my performance. Jonathan Pierce stood quietly right beside me on the concrete steps. My ruthless corporate lawyer held a thick leather briefcase containing everything. The briefcase held the final divorce settlement that would end it. He looked at me with a perfectly neutral and calm expression. He gave me a single silent nod of absolute mutual understanding. It was finally time to walk inside and finish the job. We walked slowly through the echoing marble corridors of the building. My heavy work boots clicked against the polished stone hallway floors. When we finally pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, the air inside felt instantly cold and incredibly suffocating. Victoria was already sitting gracefully at the wooden petitioner table inside. She looked like absolute royalty, waiting to claim her newly stolen crown. She was wearing an immaculate tailored white designer dress that easily cost more than my very first transport truck decades ago. Her posture was perfectly straight, and her chin was tilted upward with supreme arrogance. Derek Vance was sitting in the wooden gallery benches right behind her. My treacherous chief financial officer was wearing a custom charcoal gray suit. He leaned back comfortably with his arms crossed over his broad chest. He looked at me with a sickening, highly triumphant and mocking smirk. He firmly believed he had completely outsmarted the clueless old man. I shuffled slowly toward the respondent table and sank heavily into the stiff wooden chair. I kept my head bowed low, staring blankly at the scratched surface of the legal table in front of me. I let my calloused hands rest weakly on my trembling lap. I wanted them to see a completely defeated, shattered man who was entirely resigned to his miserable and pathetic fate. The heavy side door swung open, and the judge walked up to the elevated wooden bench to preside. He was an older, stern-looking man with a deeply lined face. He banged his heavy wooden gavel once, calling the official divorce hearing to absolute and total judicial order. Victoria's lawyer immediately stood up from his chair to speak loudly. He was a slick, aggressive corporate bulldog with a booming, arrogant voice. He addressed the honorable judge with an attitude of supreme, untouchable confidence. He proudly announced that the two disagreeing parties had successfully reached a comprehensive, completely uncontested marital settlement agreement. He began to list the brutal one-sided terms of the aggressive corporate takeover for the official court record. He officially stated that Victoria Gallagher would immediately receive 100% absolute ownership of the entire Gallagher Corporation. She would receive the primary private estate, the luxury vehicles, and every single commercial asset currently held under my legal name. He stated that I was voluntarily relinquishing my entire life's work without requiring any financial compensation or monthly alimony. Jonathan immediately stood up from his chair to play his part. He was a brilliant actor who knew exactly how to manipulate a room. He slammed his hands down on our wooden table and raised his voice in perfectly feigned and desperate outrage. He argued passionately that this settlement was completely unconscionable and deeply unfair. He aggressively pointed out that I had spent 40 brutal years building that massive commercial empire from absolute grinding scratch. He pleaded with the judge to deeply consider the sheer inequity of leaving a 70-year-old man entirely destitute. Jonathan dramatically turned toward Victoria and begged her legal team to allow me to retain just 10% of the logistics division. He pleaded for just enough money to allow me to live out my final years in basic, quiet dignity. Victoria simply rolled her eyes and let out a quiet, dismissive sigh. Her slick lawyer immediately shot down Jonathan's passionate and desperate plea. He aggressively reminded the court that I was voluntarily agreeing to these exact terms to avoid a lengthy, deeply unpleasant legal battle regarding alleged financial irregularities. He was cleverly hinting at Derek's vicious threat to release the doctored corporate tax files to the strict federal authorities. He stated that his client was being incredibly generous by simply allowing me to quietly walk away, a completely free man. He aggressively demanded that the final settlement remain exactly as written, with Victoria taking absolute and total control of the entire corporate portfolio. Jonathan let his broad shoulders slump down in completely fake defeat. He looked down at me with a perfectly crafted look of profound, agonizing sorrow. He then slowly turned back to the judge and stated that we would officially concede to all of their brutal financial demands. However, Jonathan raised his right finger and firmly stated that we had one absolute, completely non-negotiable contractual condition. He explained that if I was going to fully surrender my entire logistics empire, I required an ironclad, completely unbreakable legal indemnity clause. He stated that Victoria must legally assume absolutely all corporate liabilities moving forward forever. He argued that I needed permanent legal peace of mind, knowing I would never be held responsible for any future debts, corporate lawsuits, or outstanding financial obligations. Victoria's lawyer actually chuckled out loud in the quiet, tense courtroom. He quickly flipped through the settlement paperwork and proudly confirmed that his client fully and gladly accepted the indemnity clause. He eagerly explained to the judge that Victoria was perfectly willing to take on all the corporate liabilities because the Gallagher Corporation was an incredibly profitable, completely debt-free goldmine. He confidently stated that the company was in immaculate financial health, so the indemnity clause was nothing more than a paranoid old man's useless, pathetic safety blanket. He had absolutely no idea about the massive leaking toxic waste dump buried deep beneath the newly purchased Red Creek tract. He had no idea that the federal government was actively preparing a devastating, inescapable $90 million environmental mandate. The stern judge pulled the thick settlement document closer. He flipped through the dense pages until he found the specific indemnity clause Jonathan drafted. The courtroom fell completely silent. The judge narrowed his sharp eyes and read the heavy legal language. He looked up from the document and focused his unwavering gaze directly onto Victoria. He spoke with a deep, commanding voice that echoed loudly through the tense room. By signing this specific document, you take full and total ownership of the Gallagher Corporation, but you also assume absolute liability for any and all debts, federal fines, and environmental obligations. Do you clearly understand the severity of this binding agreement? Victoria did not hesitate for a single second. She looked down at me, flashed a cold, deeply arrogant smirk, and firmly believed she had finally conquered my entire world forever. I accept, she declared proudly. The heavy wooden gavel banged loudly across the absolutely silent room. The heavy wooden gavel banged loudly across the absolutely silent room. The sharp, echoing crack of the wood signaled the absolute end of our 30-year marriage and the complete transfer of my $90 million empire. The stern judge formally dismissed the proceedings and stood up from his elevated bench. Victoria immediately sprang up from her wooden chair. She smoothed the pristine fabric of her white designer dress and let out a long, highly theatrical sigh of relief. She turned around and looked directly at Derek. My former chief financial officer gave her a slow, deeply triumphant nod. Her slick corporate lawyer was quickly packing his heavy leather briefcase, smiling broadly and aggressively shaking her hand. They were all openly celebrating their flawless, massive victory right in front of my face. I remained seated at the respondent table for a few extra moments. I kept my head bowed and my broad shoulders heavily slumped, perfectly maintaining the pathetic facade of a completely broken, totally defeated old man until the courtroom began to slowly empty out. Jonathan Pierce closed his legal folder quietly. My ruthless attorney looked down at me and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of absolute mutual understanding. The legal trap was officially locked, sealed, and legally binding. There was absolutely no turning back now. I stood slowly and walked heavily out of the tense courtroom. I shuffled down the long, echoing marble corridor, listening to the sharp click of Victoria's expensive high heels clicking confidently somewhere far ahead of me. When I finally pushed open the heavy front doors of the county courthouse, the bright, blinding midday Dallas sun hit my tired face. The thick, suffocating Texas heat immediately washed over my tailored suit. I stopped right at the top of the wide, sweeping concrete steps. I took a very long, deep breath of the fresh outdoor air. The pathetic, trembling old man act instantly, completely vanished from my physical posture. I straightened my back, rolled my stiff shoulders, and stood up to my full, natural height. I looked down at the bustling city street below me, feeling an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute total freedom. I heard the distinct, arrogant sound of footsteps approaching me from the side. Victoria was casually strolling toward me, flanked closely by Derek and her highly paid corporate lawyer. She stopped just a few feet away from where I was standing. She slowly reached into her designer purse and pulled out a pair of oversized, incredibly expensive designer sunglasses. She slid the dark shades gracefully over her eyes, completely masking whatever small shred of human soul she might have had left inside her. She looked at me with a sickening, highly superior smirk that made my stomach turn. She did not offer a single word of gratitude, remorse, or basic human decency. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "You built it, but I own it now," she stated with supreme, untouchable arrogance. "Have a nice life in a trailer park, William." Derek let out a cruel, mocking laugh right behind her. They both looked at me, fully expecting me to finally break down and cry or scream or beg for some pathetic form of basic financial mercy. I did not flinch. I did not frown. I did not say a single solitary word in response to her brutal insult. I simply raised my left arm, pulled back the cuff of my dark suit jacket, and very calmly checked the silver face of my classic wristwatch. I looked back up at her confused face and gave her a very small, incredibly cold smile. "Right on time," I whispered quietly, before Victoria could even open her mouth to ask what I was talking about. The sudden deafening sound of heavy roaring engines completely shattered the quiet afternoon air. 5 massive matte black tactical sport utility vehicles came speeding wildly around the busy downtown street corner. Their heavy tires screeched violently against the hot asphalt, sending up thick plumes of white smoke. The heavy vehicles aggressively jumped the bottom concrete curb and aggressively blocked the entire front entrance of the county courthouse. The heavy tactical doors flew open simultaneously. More than a dozen heavily armed federal agents poured out onto the street with absolute terrifying military precision. They were wearing dark sunglasses and heavy navy blue tactical windbreakers. The bright yellow block letters stenciled across their broad backs were instantly recognizable. Half of them read FBI, and the other half read EPA. Victoria took a sudden, highly panicked step backward. Her arrogant smirk instantly vanished completely, replaced by a look of sheer, confused terror. Derek froze, completely stiff, his eyes darting frantically around the plaza, as if he was desperately looking for a clear path to run away. The federal agents did not hesitate. They marched directly up the wide concrete steps in a tight, highly coordinated formation, moving straight toward our small group. The lead federal agent, a tall, incredibly intimidating man with a completely stern face, stopped directly in front of Victoria and her highly paid corporate lawyer. "Are you the legally designated representation for Victoria Gallagher?" The agent asked, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute, uncompromising federal authority. The slick corporate lawyer puffed up his chest foolishly, trying to maintain his usual aggressive courtroom dominance. He proudly confirmed his legal identity and arrogantly demanded to know exactly why heavily armed federal agents were harassing his wealthy client outside a family courthouse. The federal agent did not even blink. He reached into his heavy tactical jacket and pulled out a massive, tightly bound stack of highly official federal documents covered in bright red legal seals. He shoved the thick federal warrant directly into the slick lawyer's waiting hands. "We are officially serving a Class 1 federal environmental mandate and immediate asset seizure warrant, directed entirely at the sole legal owner of the Gallagher Corporation," the agent stated firmly. Victoria looked at her lawyer with deep, frantic confusion. She nervously demanded to know what was happening. The arrogant corporate lawyer quickly flipped open the thick federal warrant. His eyes darted rapidly across the dense, highly technical legal paragraphs. I stood perfectly still, watching his facial expression completely transform. The arrogant, victorious color drained entirely out of his face in a matter of seconds. His skin turned completely ash-white. His hands began to tremble so violently that the heavy federal papers audibly rustled in the quiet afternoon air. He realized the terrifying, inescapable magnitude of the absolute indemnity clause he had just proudly advised his client to sign only 10 minutes ago. "What does it say?" Victoria screamed, her voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming panic. "What do they want from my company?" The slick lawyer slowly raised his head. He looked at Victoria with a gaze of pure, unadulterated, absolute horror. His professional career was completely ruined, and her life was entirely over. He opened his trembling mouth, struggling to form the words as the federal agents moved in closer to secure the perimeter. He looked her right in the eyes and whispered the 5 words that ended her world. "You owe $90 million. Victoria stood perfectly still on the bright concrete steps of the county courthouse. The 5 devastating words her lawyer just whispered hung heavily in the suffocating afternoon heat. She blinked rapidly, her face twisting into a mask of deep, agonizing confusion. She demanded to know what he was talking about. She angrily insisted that the Gallagher Corporation was an incredibly profitable logistics empire, completely free of any corporate debt. She screamed that there must be some kind of ridiculous administrative mistake. The lead federal agent from the Environmental Protection Agency did not give her lawyer a chance to respond. He stepped directly into the center of our small group, his heavy tactical boots planting firmly on the concrete. He looked at Victoria with absolute, uncompromising federal authority. He informed her that there was no administrative mistake whatsoever. He clearly explained that less than 2 weeks ago, her chief financial officer secretly authorized a massive corporate purchase of the Red Creek tract. He stated that the specific 500-acre parcel was currently sitting directly on top of the largest undocumented toxic chemical waste dump in the entire state of Texas. Victoria snapped her head around to look at Derek. Her eyes were wide with sudden, terrifying realization. Derek took a slow, highly panicked step backward. He opened his mouth to speak, but the federal agent raised his hand and continued speaking with brutal, mechanical efficiency. The agent explained that the federal government had just issued a mandatory non-negotiable toxic excavation order for that exact property. He stated that the estimated cost of the comprehensive environmental cleanup was $90 million. Because Victoria Gallagher had just signed a legally binding divorce settlement containing an absolute indemnity clause, she was now the sole legal owner of the contaminated property. She had voluntarily assumed 100% of all associated corporate liabilities. The agent calmly informed her that the federal government was immediately freezing all of her newly acquired corporate accounts, her private bank accounts, and her personal real estate holdings to secure the mandatory $90 million federal debt. Victoria staggered backward as if she had just been physically struck in the chest. She gasped for air, her perfectly manicured hands desperately clutching the front of her expensive white designer dress. She turned her frantic, terrified gaze toward Derek. She screamed at him, demanding to know how he could have possibly missed a massive toxic waste dump during the initial commercial real estate survey. Before Derek could even attempt to formulate a pathetic excuse, a second federal agent stepped forward. This agent wore a dark tactical jacket with the letters FBI printed brightly across his chest. He looked directly at Derek and stated that he knew exactly how the environmental survey was missed. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been quietly tracking a series of highly suspicious, completely illegal offshore wire transfers moving through the Cayman Islands. The FBI agent firmly announced that they possessed absolute, undeniable proof that Derek Vance had deliberately bribed a corrupt local land surveyor to intentionally falsify the official environmental soil reports. They knew Derek desperately wanted to fast-track the massive land acquisition before the divorce proceedings finalized. The agent pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He stated that Derek was being placed under immediate federal arrest for severe wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the direct bribery of a licensed commercial official. Derek looked at the gleaming steel handcuffs, and his arrogant, victorious composure completely shattered into a million pieces. The absolute reality of spending the next 20 years rotting inside a tiny federal prison cell finally hit his treacherous mind. In a sudden, incredibly foolish moment of pure panic, Derek decided to run. He violently shoved Victoria out of his way, sending her stumbling hard into her slick corporate lawyer. Derek turned around and sprinted frantically down the wide concrete steps of the courthouse, desperately running toward the busy downtown street. He did not even make it 10 yards. Two heavily armed federal agents immediately lunged forward with terrifying explosive speed. They tackled Derek incredibly hard right onto the solid concrete sidewalk. The brutal, sickening thud of his body hitting the hard pavement echoed loudly across the open plaza. Derek cried out in sudden, agonizing pain as the highly trained agents pinned his arms forcefully behind his back. They locked the heavy steel handcuffs securely around his wrists, completely neutralizing the man who had confidently tried to steal my entire legacy. He was dragged aggressively up from the ground, his custom-tailored suit completely torn and covered in gray street dust. He looked absolutely pathetic. I stood perfectly still near the top of the courthouse steps, watching the beautiful, chaotic destruction of my absolute worst enemies. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the inevitable consequences of their own limitless greed finally consume them. Victoria was completely hyperventilating now. Her chest heaved violently as the federal agents continued to explain the total seizure of her personal assets. The slick corporate lawyer quickly backed away from her, holding his hands up in the air. He nervously announced that he could no longer represent her under these severe federal circumstances. He turned around and rapidly walked away, completely abandoning his wealthy client, the exact second her massive fortune officially evaporated. Victoria was left standing entirely alone, surrounded by federal agents holding thick stacks of devastating legal warrants. The absolute terrifying reality of her bleak future crashed down upon her shoulders. She had not stolen a golden commercial logistics empire today. She had happily signed up for an inescapable financial death sentence. She was going to lose the sprawling mansion, the expensive luxury cars, and every single penny she had ever known. She was going to spend the rest of her natural life completely drowning in insurmountable federal debt. Her knees finally buckled under the crushing, unimaginable weight of her monumental failure. She dropped heavily onto the hard concrete steps, directly landing on her expensive designer dress. She looked up at me with tears streaming uncontrollably down her perfectly made-up face. The cold, deeply arrogant woman who had told me to enjoy a life in a trailer park just 5 minutes ago was completely gone. She was instantly replaced by a desperate, sobbing, completely broken beggar. She reached her shaking hands out toward my shoes. She cried out my name, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated desperation. She begged me to call my lawyer and cancel the final divorce settlement. She frantically promised to give the entire company back to me immediately. She sobbed that she had made a terrible mistake and begged me to save her from this massive federal nightmare. She pleaded for the generous, loving husband she had spent the last year secretly trying to destroy. I looked down at the pathetic, sobbing woman kneeling right at my feet. I felt absolutely no pity in my heavy heart and walked away forever. I walked away from those grand limestone steps of the county courthouse without looking back a single time. I could hear Victoria screaming my name until the heavy wooden doors of the building closed securely behind me. I walked directly to my rusty pickup truck, climbed inside the warm cabin, and drove away from the chaotic downtown streets. The deafening sound of federal sirens faded completely into the distance. I rolled down the window and let the warm Texas breeze hit my face. For the first time in an entire year, I felt absolutely no weight on my tired shoulders. The massive $90 million toxic anchor that had threatened to drag my entire family down into the dark abyss was completely gone. I drove toward the open country highway, leaving the deceitful corporate world entirely behind me. The rapid fallout from the sudden federal raid was absolutely spectacular to watch. By the very next morning, the local financial news channels were aggressively broadcasting the complete catastrophic collapse of the Gallagher Corporation. The strict federal government moved with a terrifying, absolute efficiency that completely paralyzed my former wife. Because Victoria had proudly and legally signed that non-negotiable indemnity clause in front of a presiding judge, she was immediately held personally liable for the massive chemical excavation. The Environmental Protection Agency did not show her a single ounce of human mercy. They officially condemned the sprawling Red Creek tract and instantly froze every single bank account tied to her name to secure the $90 million cleanup mandate. Her spectacular downfall was a brutal, incredibly fast descent into absolute poverty. Within just 3 weeks, a fleet of heavy federal tow trucks arrived at the private estate in North Dallas. I watched the evening news broadcast clear helicopter footage of her shiny, expensive luxury cars being aggressively dragged out of the circular driveway. The massive, beautifully manicured mansion that I had poured millions of dollars into was officially seized by the federal authorities to be liquidated at a public government auction. Victoria was violently evicted from the premises with nothing but 2 small suitcases of basic clothing. The high society circles that she had spent decades trying to impress completely abandoned her overnight. Her wealthy friends stopped returning her desperate phone calls, and her expensive country club membership was immediately and permanently revoked. She was left entirely destitute, but the nightmare was only just beginning for her. Because she was the sole corporate owner of a federally condemned environmental hazard, she was ultimately hit with severe criminal negligence charges. She was forced to file for absolute permanent bankruptcy while desperately relying on an overworked public defender to keep her out of a federal prison cell. She had tried to starve her own son to secure her fortune, and now she was learning exactly what real starvation felt like. Derek Vance faced an even more brutal, completely unforgiving reckoning. My former chief financial officer was absolutely denied any form of bail due to the severe flight risk his hidden offshore accounts presented. The Federal Bureau of Investigation meticulously dismantled his entire network of hidden shell companies. They easily found the thick digital paper trail of illicit offshore bribes he had paid to the corrupt local land surveyor. They discovered exactly how he had manipulated the official environmental soil reports to quickly fast-track the real estate acquisition. During his publicized criminal trial, Derek desperately tried to pin the entire toxic mess on me. He claimed that I had orchestrated the entire illegal purchase before the final divorce proceedings. But Jonathan Pierce, my brilliant and ruthless corporate attorney, proudly provided the federal prosecutors with a mountain of undeniable time-stamped digital evidence. He showed them exactly how Derek had permanently locked me out of the primary corporate banking servers weeks before the land was ever purchased. He provided the flawless digital logs proving Derek had forged my authorized signature to steal the corporate liquidity. The stern federal judge showed absolutely no leniency to the arrogant man who had tried to steal my entire life's work. Derek was officially convicted of multiple severe federal crimes, including massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the direct bribery of a licensed commercial official. He was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The slick, tailored designer suits he loved to wear were permanently replaced by a cheap orange prison jumpsuit. The arrogant, triumphant smirk I had seen on his face during my 70th birthday gala was completely erased forever. He was going to spend the next decade and a half locked inside a tiny concrete cell, surrounded by dangerous men, who did not care about his empty corporate titles. The toxic rot that had silently infected my business and my personal life was finally completely excised. While my enemies were busy drowning in the inescapable consequences of their own limitless greed, I quietly began to build a brand new life. I used a small portion of the $15 million from my completely clean, untouchable offshore trust to purchase a beautiful ranch located deep in the peaceful Texas hill country. It was located miles away from the industrial zones and the crowded city streets. The massive property featured gently rolling green hills, a large, clear, freshwater pond, and a sturdy wrap around wooden porch. I spent my quiet mornings simply watching the bright golden sun rise slowly over the tall, swaying oak trees. I did not have to wear stiff, uncomfortable tailored suits anymore. I did not have to attend fake, pretentious high society galas or constantly watch my back in cutthroat executive boardrooms. I was finally allowed to just be a simple, hardworking man again, enjoying the quiet reward of my endless patience. I walked out onto my wide wooden porch on a beautiful Tuesday afternoon. The bright Texas sun was shining warmly against my face, and the surrounding countryside was completely peaceful and still. I walked over to the small wooden table resting near my favorite rocking chair. I picked up a heavy glass pitcher filled with ice-cold sweet tea. The condensation dripped slowly down the smooth sides of the glass. I carefully poured the refreshing golden liquid into 2 tall drinking glasses. The ice cubes clinked softly together, making a comforting, familiar sound in the afternoon air. I set the pitcher back down onto the wooden table and simply stood there, looking out over the long gravel driveway that led directly up to my beautiful new home. A heavy dark green pickup truck slowly pulled up the long dirt and gravel driveway. It was Lucas finally bringing his family to see the new estate we were going to share. The brutal corporate war was officially over, and the very best part of my life was just about to begin with the people who deserved to be here. I lifted my glass, completely ready for whatever incredible future lay ahead for my true, unbroken bloodline. I took a long, deeply refreshing sip of the perfectly chilled sweet tea. It tasted like absolute, undeniable victory, a sweet reminder that patience is the sharpest weapon of all. I watched the dark green pickup truck roll to a gentle stop near the base of my wide wooden porch. The heavy engine clicked off, and the surrounding Texas countryside returned to its perfect, absolute silence. The driver's side door opened, and Lucas stepped out onto the gravel driveway. My son looked completely different from the desperate, exhausted man I had found sleeping in a freezing warehouse parking lot just a few short months ago. He was wearing a sharp, dark navy suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His posture was incredibly straight, and his eyes were bright with a fierce, undeniable confidence. He walked around the front of the heavy truck to open the passenger door for his wife. Rachel stepped out carefully into the warm afternoon sun. The severe stress and terrifying medical anxiety that had previously plagued her daily life were completely gone. Her cheeks were flush with a healthy, vibrant color, and she was smiling with genuine, profound happiness. She rested her hand gently on her beautifully swollen, pregnant belly. They walked up the wooden steps of the porch together, their hands tightly locked. They looked like a true, unbreakable team ready to conquer the entire world. I set my glass of sweet tea down on the small table and stood up to greet them. Lucas pulled me into a fierce, incredibly tight embrace. He did not feel like a junior floor manager anymore. He felt exactly like a strong, capable leader who was fully prepared to carry the heavy weight of a massive legacy on his back. Rachel hugged me warmly, pressing her cheek against my chest. I guided them over to the comfortable rocking chairs, resting in the cool shade of the porch overhang. Lucas did not sit down immediately. He reached into his leather satchel and pulled out a thick, heavy roll of crisp architectural blueprints. He cleared his throat, unable to hide the massive, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He unrolled the large documents directly over the wooden table, pinning the corners down with our glass cups so the gentle breeze would not blow them away. I leaned forward to examine the highly detailed schematics. They were the master building plans for our brand new commercial logistics facility. This massive new company was entirely funded by the $15 million private offshore trust I had secretly transferred into his name on the eve of the final divorce hearing. Lucas eagerly pointed to the massive loading docks, the highly optimized freight sorting zones, and the beautiful modern administrative offices. He carefully explained his incredibly brilliant operational strategies with a level of sharp, calculated intelligence that made my chest swell with immense paternal pride. He had taken every single hard lesson I ever taught him and vastly improved upon them. He proudly informed me that he had already secured 3 major commercial shipping contracts based solely on the impeccable reputation of our family name. This new enterprise was completely clean, entirely legally bulletproof, and utterly free from the toxic, poisonous influence of his greedy mother and my treacherous former executive staff. We were not just casually starting over. We were aggressively building an impenetrable fortress that no corrupt lawyer or greedy spouse could ever possibly breach again. Rachel walked slowly around the wooden table and sat gently on the edge of my rocking chair. She reached out and took my rough, calloused hand in her soft fingers. She placed my hand very carefully directly against the side of her very pregnant belly. We sat in absolute silence for a few quiet moments. Suddenly, I felt a strong, sudden kick press hard against my waiting palm. A massive, uncontrollable smile broke across my weathered face. I looked up at Lucas, who was watching us with eyes full of deep, profound love. In that beautiful, quiet moment on the porch, I finally understood the absolute truth about building an empire. A true legacy has absolutely nothing to do with massive steel warehouses, heavy concrete foundations, or sprawling commercial transport fleets. Those things are just cold, lifeless objects that can be easily stolen, legally seized, or completely destroyed by a single federal environmental mandate. A true, lasting empire is the unbreakable bloodline you leave behind. It is the absolute, unwavering loyalty of the family who stands faithfully by your side when you have absolutely nothing left in your pockets. It is the profound resilience to completely tear down a rotting, severely corrupted structure so you can safely build a brand new, purified foundation for the innocent generations that will eventually follow you. I leaned back slowly into my comfortable wooden rocking chair. I looked out over the vast, sweeping Texas landscape stretching endlessly before me. The rolling green hills seemed to gently touch the bright, cloudless blue sky. I reflected deeply on my 40 brutal years of constant agonizing physical sweat. I thought about the thousands of lonely nights I spent driving cargo trucks just to put food on the table. I thought about the terrifying, vicious betrayal that had so nearly broken my spirit and completely erased my existence. My treacherous enemies had desperately tried to bury me in the dark, toxic dirt, completely unaware that I was a deeply rooted seed waiting for the perfect moment to violently crack the concrete. I had successfully survived the absolute worst forms of human greed simply by refusing to play their desperate, panicking game. I had ultimately achieved the greatest victory of my entire life, not through loud, aggressive courtroom screaming or violent physical confrontation, but through the quiet, lethal application of absolute patience. I watched my strong, capable son carefully roll up his new commercial blueprints, completely ready to lead our family into a bright, untouchable future. I picked up my cold glass of sweet tea and took another long, deeply satisfying sip. The toxic rot that had silently infected my business and my personal life for decades was finally completely excised from my world forever. I had willingly surrendered a rotting $90 million poison just to secure the absolutely priceless, beautiful family sitting right in front of me today. We sat quietly on the wide wooden porch, listening to the gentle rustling of the tall oak trees blowing in the warm afternoon breeze. I looked at the dark green pickup truck parked comfortably in the gravel driveway and felt an overwhelming sense of absolute permanent peace. There were no hidden corporate agendas here. There were no manipulative spouses plotting in the dark hallways. There were only honest people ready to build a new world based on genuine trust and unwavering mutual respect. I closed my tired eyes for a brief moment, letting the bright afternoon sun warm my aging face. I took a deep, steady breath, completely satisfied with the incredibly harsh but absolutely necessary choices I had made to protect my own flesh and blood. The old empire was officially dead, buried under a mountain of inescapable federal debt and spectacular personal ruin. But looking at my smiling son and my glowing daughter-in-law, I knew without a single doubt that my true everlasting legacy was just beginning to beautifully bloom. It has been 3 years since that beautiful afternoon on my wide wooden porch. Time moves at a completely different pace when you are no longer constantly looking over your shoulder. The ruthless corporate world of downtown Dallas feels like an entirely different lifetime now. I wake up every single morning before the sun crests over the rolling green hills of my private ranch. I do not rush to put on a tailored suit. I do not nervously check my secure phone for fraudulent offshore banking alerts. I simply put on my faded denim jeans, pour myself a hot cup of black coffee, and walk down to the quiet freshwater pond to fish. My physical health has improved dramatically. The suffocating chest pains that Victoria eagerly hoped would finally kill me have completely vanished into the clear country air. I feel genuinely young again. The brand new logistics company that Lucas built from the ground up is thriving beyond my wildest expectations. He took that legally bulletproof $15 million trust and completely transformed it into a highly respected regional powerhouse. He named the new enterprise Vanguard Freight and Logistics. It is a fitting name for a company that leads with uncompromising integrity. Lucas proved to be a far better chief executive officer than I ever was. I built my original empire using brute physical force and grinding intimidation. Lucas builds his empire using deep mutual respect and unwavering loyalty to his hardworking employees. He personally knows the names of every truck driver who hauls our cargo. He pays them a truly fair living wage, and he ensures they always make it home safely. Because he treats his workforce like actual human beings, they are fiercely loyal to him. Our shipping contracts have tripled. My beautiful daughter-in-law, Rachel, gave birth to a perfectly healthy baby girl 2.5 years ago. They named her Eleanor after my own late mother, who taught me the value of honest hard work. Having a granddaughter has brought immeasurable joy into my quiet life. Every Sunday afternoon, without fail, Lucas and Rachel drive their dark green pickup truck down the gravel road to my ranch. We spend hours cooking massive family dinners together in my spacious country kitchen. We sit around the large wooden dining table, laughing loudly and enjoying the unbroken bond of our restored family. I watch little Eleanor run happily across the thick green grass of the backyard. This uninterrupted peace is the true definition of a successful life. The catastrophic collapse of my former empire is now nothing more than a distant, ugly memory. The massive Red Creek tract remains heavily barricaded behind towering chain-link fences and bright yellow federal warning signs. The Environmental Protection Agency is still actively excavating the toxic chemical waste that Derek Vance foolishly purchased with my stolen cash reserves. The name Gallagher Corporation is permanently synonymous with massive federal bankruptcy and catastrophic environmental negligence. I do not mourn the complete loss of that rotting corporate structure for a single second. It was a deeply infected vessel that needed to be entirely destroyed so my bloodline could safely survive. While my new life is filled with abundant sunshine and genuine family laughter. Victoria's current reality is a dark, inescapable nightmare of her own deliberate making. The brutal federal bankruptcy courts stripped her of absolutely everything she once valued. She lost the sprawling estate in North Dallas. She lost her imported luxury vehicles, her immaculate designer wardrobe, and her priceless diamond jewelry collections. The high society circles she desperately tried to impress completely erased her name from their exclusive guest lists. Today, Victoria lives completely alone in a tiny, severely cramped apartment located in a dangerous, rundown neighborhood on the far outskirts of the city. Through various legal updates regarding the final liquidation of the old corporate assets, I learned the bleak details of her miserable existence. Her tiny apartment complex is notoriously infested with crawling cockroaches and suffocating black mold. She does not have a private driver or a personal chef anymore. She is forced to rely on the unreliable public transportation system just to travel to her minimum wage retail job at a local discount department store. The woman who once wore $60,000 dresses now wears a cheap synthetic uniform and stands on her feet for 8 brutal hours a day to afford basic groceries. The absolute weight of her $90 million federal debt ensures she will never be able to legally own anything of value again. Despite the undeniable finality of our brutal divorce, Victoria still desperately tries to reach out to me. Every single month, like a pathetic clockwork ritual, a thin white envelope arrives in my secure rural mailbox. The envelopes are always addressed in her elegant, sweeping, cursive handwriting. The paper she uses now is incredibly cheap and highly prone to tearing. I know exactly what those pathetic letters contain without ever slicing them open. They are filled with rambling, highly emotional apologies. They are filled with begging pleas for financial forgiveness and desperate requests for a second chance. She inevitably tries to play the manipulative card of our 30-year history together. I never open even one of her letters. I do not read her pathetic, lying words. I do not allow her toxic voice to re-enter my purified world for even a fraction of a second. I simply take a thick, black, permanent marker from my kitchen drawer. I calmly draw a solid black line directly through my printed name on the front of the cheap white envelope. I write 3 definitive words across the front in unmistakable block letters. Return to sender. I walk down my gravel driveway, place the marked envelope back inside the secure metal mailbox, and firmly raise the small red delivery flag. Victoria made her brutal choices, with her eyes wide open. She eagerly tried to steal my entire life's work. She coldly attempted to starve her own biological son to secure her massive, illicit fortune. She happily signed a binding legal document that she arrogantly believed would leave me completely destitute and broken on the streets of Dallas. I simply gave her exactly what she desperately demanded. She wanted total control of the corporate empire, and she received it in its entirety. The inescapable, suffocating misery of her roach-infested reality is the direct consequence of her own terrifying greed. I sit comfortably on my wide wooden porch as the golden sun begins to dip below the distant western horizon. I listen to the joyful, innocent laughter of my beautiful granddaughter echoing happily from the open kitchen window. I hear the deep, strong, confident voice of my successful son as he talks lovingly to his beautiful wife. I look out over the vast, untouched acres of my peaceful Texas ranch, feeling an overwhelming, profound sense of absolute, permanent victory. I successfully defended my family, protected my true legacy, and completely destroyed the wicked wolves who tried to eat us alive. The corporate war is permanently over, the toxic enemies have been entirely vanquished, and the incredibly beautiful, quiet peace of my new life is absolutely flawless. If there is one thing 40 years of pouring concrete and surviving betrayal has taught me, it is this. Greed is the most effective poison, because the greedy will gladly drink it themselves if you put it in a golden cup. Never mistake a man's silence for weakness, and never assume an older man has forgotten how to fight. True wealth is not in bank accounts, real estate, or stock portfolios. It is entirely in the loyalty of your blood, the integrity of your actions, and the patience to quietly let your absolute worst enemies dig their own inescapable graves. If you have ever had to fight back against someone who selfishly tried to take absolutely everything away from you, drop a like on this video. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories and tell me in the comments down below. What would you have done in my shoes?